Welcome you to Demos. My name is Nancy Cawthon, and I'm the director of the Economic Opportunity Program here. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we're a nonprofit nonpartisan public policy research center, and we focus on 4 overarching goals, and that is a more equitable economy with shared prosperity, a vibrant and inclusive democracy with high levels of voting, an empowered public sector that works for the common good, and responsible U.S. engagement in an interdependent world. Tonight's event focuses on a fabulous book by economist Nancy Folbre called Saving State U: Why We Must Fix Public Higher Education. And I want to introduce you to our co-sponsors of the event in just a second. But first, I want to say a little bit about why this book and this particular issue is so important to us here at Demos. Saving State U really deals with the crisis that we're having in our public education system. 30 years ago in this country, we had a public higher education system that was the envy of the world. And states generously funded their universities, and federal policies, the GI Bill, the Higher Education Act of 1965, all of these things opened up higher education to folks who had previously been excluded. And this rapid growth of a college-educated population helped fuel the economy, helped fuel the growth of a strong middle class. And then the tide turned, and here we are 30 years later. We're in a situation where a college degree is almost essential to getting a decent job, getting ahead in the labor market, entering and staying in the middle class. Yet, at this very crucial moment, the cost of a higher education has become unaffordable for many low-income students, but also middle-income students. And so we'll hear a lot more about why this is the case. But we're facing a situation where even though enrollments have continued to rise and access has increased, graduation rates really haven't budged. They've moved around a little bit, but they haven't budged in 35 years. They're about where they were in 1975. I think that's 35 years ago. But in any case, we care very, very passionately about this issue at Demos because we do a good bit of work on how to expand economic opportunity for young people from the whole range of getting a higher education, getting started in the labor market, looking at the high cost of raising a family. And so this higher education piece is really crucial to that story. So I'd really like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, who include the CUNY Campaign to Defend Education and the Professional Staff Congress at CUNY. And we have Steve London here from that organization and more, and we'll introduce him in a minute. But I'd also like to thank the New Press, and we are honored to have with us Andre Schifrin, a founder of the New Press, and also Ellen Adler from the New Press. And so I'd like to turn it over to Andre to say a few words.
Well, as you've heard, this is going to be a really very interesting and important talk about a crisis that many people aren't aware of. I just want to mention briefly that Nancy has done a great deal of work over many years in very different fields. We started working together well over a dozen years ago, I think, when we published her first book on American economic issues, The Invisible Heart, which was a look at women and their contribution outside the normal economic system, at home and otherwise, and the degree to which that was not recognized economically and how important it would be to do so. I'm glad we have a link here with CUNY because this book, in a way, goes back to Joe Murphy, then Chancellor of CUNY, many years ago, who said to me 15 years or so ago, if not longer, this is going to be a major crisis. You can see the degree to which the attacks on public education are growing, and you guys should get a book. And happily, Nancy was willing to take on that task in a way different from what she'd done in the past and yet linked to what she had done. So I think we're going to have a conjunction of various interests here. The New Press was founded close to 20 years ago to publish precisely this kind of book. It was meant to take on the books that the large corporations were afraid to do, either for political or commercial reasons. And we've now published close to 1,000 books over the last decades in various fields, and you can see our catalog on the web. We're very proud that Nancy has been among these books. She's indirectly in another book we're publishing later in the spring, the so-called Sarkozy report that was done by Joe Stiglitz and Nancy and others on how do you redefine the concept of the GDP. So look out for that book as well, which will be coming. But the important book for tonight, and I think the important book for many years to come, will be the one Nancy will tell you about. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Demos for hosting this event. Andre, I have to say, is my hero and also my muse, and has often been my salvation. And he's been that to many writers, and I think that's one of the reasons the New Press has made such a really great contribution to our political and intellectual life, and I hope it will continue to do so. I've been teaching economics for about 28 years at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and that's kind of where my story begins, with some graffiti in Thompson Hall. I mass, you mass, we all mass at UMass. For the last 10 years, facing pretty much continual budget cuts and budget stringency, our slogan has been save UMass, which if you say it really fast, sort of sounds like save your ass, which is a pretty short step to save our ass. And while the story began as a kind of small and personal account of what it's like to experience the dismantling of a great public institution, the process led me toward a national and sometimes even kind of international analysis of what's going on with public higher education. And that's really what I want to share with you tonight. So why must we fix public higher education? Well, first, we need it, and we need it really desperately in order to maintain and to build an opportunity society. That's an argument based on political principle. Secondly, public higher education isn't just an investment, it's an intergenerational commitment. It's part of a social contract that allows us to share the costs and the risks of developing human capabilities. I think it's been a very successful and efficient contract, and that's an economic argument that I want to talk about a little bit tonight and that I develop in more detail in the book. Excuse me. Third thing, public higher education is really broken. Its foundations are crumbling in a kind of California-style mudslide that's particularly visible in California, but also on the East Coast, particularly in Massachusetts and New York, and also hitting in the heartland in Illinois, Arizona, and other states. And I think that's a harbinger of things to come. That is, it's not just a product of the current recession and the current crisis, but it's kind of the culmination of a very long-term trend. And that's an argument based on policy analysis and also personal experience. So the really big question, of course, is how are we going to fix it? And I'm going to give you some answers ranging from the very specific, as in join the National Day of Action and Strike that is planned for March 4th, that's been promoted by the California students in collaboration with California faculty and staff at the University of California system, and which is now being organized on a lot of campuses around the country. And of course, in the long run, to start mobilizing support to make public higher education not only to strengthen it, but to expand it. And I will argue that we should expand it to make it available for free to everyone who's able to take good advantage of it. All right, so what do we mean when we talk about an opportunity society? To me, it means we want to develop people's capabilities to the fullest. We want to nourish their motivation, the kind of motivation that's necessary to persuade youngsters and young adults to spend 22 years or more devoted to learning. I think we need to insist that the Opportunity Society should also extend to working adults. Now that we have a large number of people who have been displaced by outsourcing and job loss, we have a really acute need to retrain and retool. Part of what an Opportunity Society means is giving people the chance to earn a decent living rather than to be nickeled and dimed. As Nancy mentioned in her introductory remarks, college education has become virtually an economic necessity. The college educated are virtually the only group within our society that's enjoyed any significant increase in real earnings over the last 20 years. The college premium has grown over time. In 1980, college graduates earned 50% more than those who had not attained that diploma. By 2000, they earned 100% more. Over a lifetime, that adds up to more than $1 million. And it's just a major determinant of people's economic fate. An Opportunity Society means giving people the chance to be upwardly mobile. In the United States, about half the advantages of having a high income are passed on to the next generation. Your parents' economic status is a pretty good predictor. It's pretty highly correlated with your own, more so than in other countries like Germany, Denmark, and even Canada. And I think that that's a kind of inheritance of economic status that's really inconsistent with the most fundamental principles of the American dream. But opportunity also means the opportunity to work productively with other people to solve collective problems. Problems that range from climate destabilization to obesity, from political dysfunction to global poverty and terrorism. In other words, to solve problems that are not necessarily related to higher personal earnings over a lifetime. And you know, this isn't just some ivory tower fantasy. When polled in 2006, 86% of Americans said that they believed that investing in colleges and universities today would help solve future problems. And I think we have an obligation to respond to that hope and that faith. Now, education is obviously a good investment based on the numbers that I just laid out for you. It offers a high social rate of return as well as a high personal rate of return. A lot of economic history has been written about the role that public education in particular has played in promoting economic development in the United States throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But it's also part of an intergenerational contract. In this country, the working age population pays taxes to educate the younger generation. And when that younger generation grows up and enters the labor force and starts paying taxes, they're the ones who pay for our retirement and our health care in old age. And I think this intergenerational contract needs more attention and more analysis. I think it's an efficient system for the same reason that I think that excuse me, universal single-payer health insurance is a good system. It contributes to efficient utilization of human resources, and it lowers the transactions costs of providing a really important service. It provides us with a really sustainable way of rewarding economic efforts that are not, and I don't think ever will be, rewarded by the capitalist market or by the traditional family. So I do devote some time in the book to trying to rethink public finance, to get people to think about it over the life cycle rather than in the cross-section. That is, think not only about the taxes that you're paying and when you're paying them, but the benefits that you're getting and when they're rolling in. Let me just insert here that I don't think our intergenerational contract is a perfect one. In fact, there are things about it that worry me and that I think are probably going to require substantial reform and attention. But I think the more fundamental problem is that a lot of taxpayers don't really understand what they're getting in return for what they're paying. And I think part of that lies with our failure to clearly articulate the nature of this dimension of the social contract. So I just want to give you one little example. How many of you have ever heard of Tax Freedom Day? It's promoted by the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. It's an effort to call attention to how much money people pay in taxes. It's devised in the following way. Starting January 1st, if you devoted your entire paycheck up front to payment of your annual taxes, on what day would you finally have paid off what you owe to the government so that you could keep everything for yourself? So in 2009, that date was April 23rd, and I'm sure it will be around that date this year, and you'll hear a lot of hoo-ha in the press about Tax Freedom Day when it emerges. But what about an alternative concept that I would call Tax Freedom Year, which is the year in which, after paying all of your taxes, you've fully compensated the taxpayers for what they spent on support for you as a young child and as a student in our educational system. To illustrate the relevance of this concept of Tax Freedom Year, I did a little calculation for the state of Massachusetts. Let's take a 22-year-old who's just graduated from my university, the flagship university, and let's assume that that person gets a job at the starting salary, median salary for a college graduate in the state of about $30,000, enjoys a 5% increase in their nominal earnings thenceforth, maybe an overly optimistic assumption, and they pay the state and local tax rate of 9.5% in the current tax rate in Massachusetts, going, to reimburse the state for what has been spent on them. And I can calculate this because I know what average spending per student was in the first grade, the second grade, the third grade, so forth and so on. And I'm basically treating this like a kind of a mortgage, that when you graduate at age 22, you begin paying back this accumulated debt, and the details about the interest rates and so forth in the simulation are all there. But I think what's really startling is it takes you 30 years. You're 51 years old before the taxes that you've paid have paid back what has already been spent on you. And I think that's an example that brings home the nature of the intergenerational transfer that's at stake and the relevance of looking at it over the life cycle. So hopefully we can talk more about some of the details and aspects of that in the question and answer session. But obviously the reason that we really need to fix public higher education is that it's broken. Tuition and fees have gone up tremendously, mostly because state support has declined. Why has state support declined? Well, geographic mobility is part of it. Capital mobility, the movement of jobs overseas and the importation of skilled labor from overseas, I think that aspect of globalization also account for it. There have been competing demands on state budgets, and a lot of federal expenditures have been shifted to states. And in addition, we've had major tax cuts that have undermined the ability of both the federal government and the state government to raise revenue. So if you look at the period from 1998 to 2009, tuition and fees at public universities were increasing at 4.5% a year, over and above the rate of inflation. Pell Grants, major form of federal aid, financial aid to students. In 1979, they covered 77% of the cost of attending. By 2007, they covered only 36%. It's no surprise. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising that students have accumulated a huge burden of personal debt to make up for the increase in costs and the reduction in financial aid. If you look at families right in the middle of the income distribution, the third quintile, with 2 quintiles above them and 2 quintiles below them, the average net college cost at a public university have gone up from about 18% to about 25% of median family income. That's not a realistic amount of money, percentage of family income for families to be able to pay to educate their students, their children. There's also, I believe, been a decline in the quality of education at our state universities. This is something that we often feel shy or embarrassed, ashamed to discuss, but I think we need to be open about it in order to call attention to the threat that it poses to the sustainability of the enterprise. Part-timers in the publics once comprised about 22% of all faculty. Now they comprise about 50%. This is a really major change with really negative implications for continuity and curriculum development and the development, the cultivation of meaningful personal long-term relationships with students. And of course, it's these long-run trends that have contributed to the vulnerability to recession and the really dramatic budget cuts, tuition and wage increases that we're seeing in a lot of states. So how are we going to fix it? Well, first and foremost, I think we need to build the consensus that it needs to be fixed and that we can fix it. And I think there are a lot of positive examples out there that we can point to. There are some states that have developed really innovative policy. The state of Georgia, with its HOPE scholarships, any student in the state with a B average gets a free ride at the state university. By all accounts, a very successful and very cost-effective program. The state of Texas, with its policy of admitting the top 10% of every high school class to the flagship university, should they desire to go there, has created a whole new form of affirmative action that has some fascinating and I think overall pretty positive implications. We've seen in the last couple of years a major extension of the GI Bill. Senator James Webb played a leadership role in returning the GI Bill to something of its former glory. It doesn't quite match up with the earlier program, but it's certainly far better and far more supportive than it exists beforehand. The Obama administration has increased Pell Grants. I think that's a really great step forward. The amount in the total amount covered has gone up by 17%. The Obama administration has reduced the burden of student loans, capping them at 15% of income, giving students protections against being forced to pay if their income drops below 150% of the poverty line. And there are also major initiatives underway, including one that Demos is contributing to expand community college education and to improve the integration of community colleges into our larger state university system. Those are all really great initiatives, and I think we really need to talk them up. It's also true that the fiscal stimulus has been a big boon to us at state universities. It's prevented a lot of institutions from feeling the brunt of budget cuts this year, although it's also a reason why next year is going to be really hairy and difficult year. But we need to do a lot more, and I think we can. Free public higher education was once basically provided by both California and New York. It got pretty good reviews. Some things went wrong. We know what they were. I think we could probably fix them. France, Germany, and Denmark are among the countries that have very successful free public higher education systems. Not totally clear what it would cost, but probably about an additional $80 billion a year to do it. Depends kind of partly on how much you think lowering the costs would increase the enrollments, and that also depends on how you would set your admissions standards. Personally, I think admission standards need to be capped at we need a pretty high bar for admission standards, but that we would still see a significant increase in enrollments if we eliminated tuition and fees. Dennis Kucinich ran on this campaign in the primaries and argued, I think, quite persuasively that it could be financed simply by rescinding the Bush tax cuts. To put $85 billion in perspective, it's about a tenth of what was spent on the financial bailout up through mid-2009. So clearly, resources are there to do it. Another perspective on financial feasibility in 2006, the average Massachusetts taxpayer spent more on state police and corrections than on public higher education. And they spent twice as much in tax money on the cost of the Iraq War as they did on public higher education. So California, the state that's suffering the most draconian budget cuts, has also mobilized the strongest political resistance. As I mentioned before, a coalition there is sponsoring a March 4th Day of Action and Strike. You can find out more about it by going to the following website, www.defendeducation.org. I think that's a pretty good domain name. I think we need to work on our slogans. My current favorite is bonuses for brains, not for banks. I hope you'll be willing to get behind that slogan. And I'm looking forward to a chance to have more discussion and back and forth with you. Thanks a lot.
Much, Nancy. We have with us today, joining for our discussion, Steve London, who's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College. So what we're going to do now is Steve's going to respond, give some comments, and then we'll have a little back and forth up here, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Nancy. And I want to thank Demos for having this event. I think shining a light on public higher education is so important for all the reasons that we've just heard. And I also want to thank Nancy, the other Nancy, for writing this wonderful book. I have to say, it's, now Nancy is an economist, and I have a certain bias about the way economists generally write, but let me tell you, it's an easy read. She deals with very complicated concepts, very straightforwardly, and I really do highly recommend it. I also should give you, make full disclosure, aside from being in political science at Brooklyn College, I'm the first vice president of the Professional Staff Congress, and really that's my full-time job these days. And in that job, I spend most of my time as the political director of the union advocating for public higher education in New York State. So I come to you with clear biases, and very happy to admit that and to talk to you about this issue. I thought what I might do is to talk some about how the themes that Nancy presents in her books apply here in New York to CUNY, and to use CUNY as a good example. Unfortunately, I speak from the belly of the beast in terms of the defunding, the problems that we have seen and that Nancy describes in her book over the last 35, 40 years. CUNY is an all too good example of the plight and the problems in public higher education. I think one of the really good points, important points that Nancy makes at the outset of her book is she talks about the big deal, or the social compact that she described, the intergenerational transfers. I like to sort of frame that just a little differently, and she goes through the history in her book. You know, in the heyday of public higher education in the post-war era, we saw a social compact that was framed by New Deal policies, and in political science we call them policy regimes. And clearly, with the GI Bill and much of the legislation in the 1960s, we saw infusion of funds and both operating and capital funds in public higher education across the country. And we're still living on the benefits of that investment that was made during that period. But starting really in the 1970s, we saw that policy regimes start to erode and break down and come to a crashing halt with the election of Ronald Reagan. And through the 1970s, especially here in New York City, you could see the rise of a different policy regime, which we have now come to call neoliberalism. And what I will propose is that we're now at the, I would hope anyway, we're seeing the end of that policy regime with nothing clearly on the horizon. And that leads to a lot of the problems that we're confronting today and a lot of the political gridlock. And there's no clear way forward out of this policy regime. But if you look at the history of CUNY, you can see how this policy was, and neoliberalism was enacted. CUNY was free from 1847 through 1978, and it was the fiscal crisis of New York City, where austerity was imposed, that saw CUNY, that free tuition policy, ended. CUNY had educated generations upon generations of students, and it was renowned and has been renowned for what it had done through the period of its, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, but also in the open admissions period in the late 60s and 70s. With the when that ended, when the free tuition ended, CUNY became very much then dependent upon state funding for operating funds. And we saw a precipitous decline in state funds. And just to give you one measure, and there are many measures, but one measure that's pretty stark and illustrative is in 1975, CUNY had 11,500 full-time faculty, had a student population of about 250,000. Today, we have a student population of around 260,000, and we are now, having rebuilt the faculty by 1,500, we are at 7,000 full-time faculty. From 11,005, we went down to almost 5,500 in the late 90s and have just very slowly added at the margins new faculty. More than half the courses are taught by adjuncts, especially that's true in the community colleges. So we have a system now that has been tremendously degraded. The results of this disinvestment and this withdrawal of funds has led to, I'll just summarize, three different structures that we see imposed in CUNY and are also exemplified throughout the country. First is the two-tier labor system. This is the adjunctification of the faculty, the use of contingent labor. This, if you go outside of academia, it's also called just-in-time production. It's the same idea where you have a flexible workforce that is brought in to meet whatever the demands. This is a terrible system, undermines the basic notion of academic freedom, because without a full-time tenured workforce, it's extremely difficult clearly for there to be independence and for academic freedom to survive. Also, another important trend is privatization. And here Nancy also describes this in her book. And the dependence, in particular, on tuition for funding. Across the country, some universities are no longer really public universities. They may be called public-assisted universities. At CUNY, clearly, we were close to 100% publicly funded, and now we're about 40 to 45% tuition funded. and other universities and in the state system that suffered also. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on outside funding when possible through philanthropy. And then the other and final tendency or structure that I want to talk about is corporatization of the university. Nancy calls this managerialism. Corporatization is a response to this defunding in many respects. As the university, as funds have become less and less, and there's a greater call for flexibility, and there is a two-tier workforce, there is also a concomitant effort on the part of management to create more hierarchy within the university, to undermine the peer review systems that have existed. And peer review is very important in the university setting. Centralized decision-making, that's been very concrete in CUNY's case, where we used to have these colleges that were very independent, and now everything is being organized within one central system. Decisions are made centrally for an allocation of resources, and that impacts greatly on how the university operates. This is all done within the context of growing social inequality, huge social inequality in New York City. We're one of the richest cities, and we're one of the poorest cities in the country. And so these inequalities, of course, manifest themselves in terms of who has access to education. And in this framework, where you see the defunding taking place and the importance, the absolute importance of CUNY for the future of this city, and there's nobody, who would disagree with CUNY being very important for the economic health of New York City. At the same time, you say, well, why is it so underfunded? What is it that's going on here that creates this incredibly rich resource, but is so poorly taken care of? I mean, I think that we have to look to, again, the neoliberal agenda. Everything that I've described here in terms of what's happened as part of CUNY is part of the neoliberal agenda and the policy regime: privatization, more reliance on tuition rather than public funding. New York State tax structure. In 1975, the top marginal rate was 15%. That's been cut by half. And just recently in this budget crisis, they bumped it up for a 3-year period as for a marginal increase up. I think it goes up to just about 9%, but that will end next year. So you have a reduction, of the tax structure, reduction in funds. So the budget crisis is really a revenue crisis. If we had the same tax structure as we had in the 1990s, just go back to the 1990s, the same tax structure, we would have $15 billion more in revenue in New York State. So what happens? What happens in this context? Well, it's pretty clear that it's difficult for public higher education to thrive. That doesn't mean that we don't serve a lot of people. It doesn't mean that enrollments don't keep growing. But the quality of the education, frankly, declines. The ability of the institution to renew, to be part of the production of knowledge in society that goes beyond being essentially a teaching university. The ability of faculty to do research is restricted. And so the institution does not really thrive. And that's an important distinction to make between seeing an institution that is serving a lot of people and thriving. What might we do about this? And I'll end with this, and then we can have some further discussion. I think that the ideas in the program that Nancy laid out are very good and important ones. Certainly, higher education, public higher education should be seen as a public good. We should try to bracket public higher education with an education agenda, pre-K to post-grad. It's all part of the same seamless and important process for individual development. Also, it's important for the university to promote democratic values, and without public higher education, it's difficult to imagine a democratic society. Access and excellence are clearly important, but all of this takes money. And since I'm sort of in the thick of it, and I've been doing this for a few years now, it's hard to see my way clear at the moment to a good outcome. I think that, as I was saying before, we're in a moment where we're seeing the decay of the neoliberal agenda, the inequalities that are becoming more and more apparent within society, are spawning, a populist backlash. But that populist backlash has so far largely been organized by the right. And it's small at this point on the right. But nonetheless, I think that's evidence of the fact that people are no longer able to see that the neoliberal agenda and these policies are working. So I do take some heart in the fact that there is this kind of populist backlash. But we haven't seen any leadership really come forward so far, certainly not within the Democratic Party, that puts forward a clear and different agenda. I give Kucinich a shout out. I don't want to include him in that. But I'm talking about some mainstream or certainly some large, an agenda that has a large popular base. So I think we should remember that there is, another reality, another university is possible. We can look back to the depths of the Great Depression, and that's when Brooklyn College was built, Queens College was built, Lehman College was started. Certainly that was during a period when the economic circumstances were terrible. But also that was a period when there were social movements, when there was a mass base that would support alternative policies. And I think that's really the challenge before us, is to work together to see how we can build the social base and social framework for the next big deal. Thank you.
I'd like to start by drilling down into the problems a bit more. And because you both described in very concrete terms this simultaneous, we've got states withdrawing their investment in higher education, we've got tuition skyrocketing. I think, and Nancy, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the median student debt that students take on getting a bachelor's degree at public universities is $18,000. Yeah. And which isn't that much less than the median debt that students at, it's a lot closer to students at private universities than you'd think. And then you both mentioned, this two-tier, this relying on adjuncts to do so much of. I'd like to start by drilling down into the problems a bit more, and because you both described in very concrete terms this simultaneous, we've got states withdrawing their investment in higher education, we've got tuition skyrocketing. I think, and Nancy, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the median student debt that students take on getting a bachelor's degree at public universities is $18,000. Yeah. And which isn't that much less than the median debt that students at, it's a lot closer to students at private universities than you'd think. And then you both mentioned, this two-tier, this relying on adjuncts to do so much of the teaching. I'm wondering if you could talk about what else is going on in terms of how universities are run, where the funding is actually going. Okay, so this higher tuition, lower quality, are the funds still being spent the same way in terms of the proportion that goes to educate students? If both of you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Well, I think Steve was right in pointing to the kind of a neoliberal strategy that helps explain what's going on. What's happened with the as states have felt the pinch of tax cuts, they've also had increased costs, and in particular Medicaid costs have risen in states, partly because healthcare costs are out of control, and also because the federal government has engaged in some pretty systematic cost shifting, trying to get states to take on more responsibility for Medicaid expenditures. No Child Left Behind is another legacy of the Republican Party that was an unfunded mandate. So it imposed a lot of requirements on schools in terms of testing and management and policy without providing the money that was needed to actually implement it. So those are all policies that have, that's sort of the proximate level of what where the budget pinch is coming from. So the pie that is the state budget is both shrinking overall, and the wedge, size of the wedge going to public higher education is also declining. But that's just the proximate cause. The real reason is, well, why, what is it that's, what are the political forces behind that? Well, what neoliberalism really means, I think, in the context of state development policy, is that businesses have withdrawn their support for public higher education. And maybe we all got a little lazy. We all kind of got used to the idea that employers had a big stake in an educated workforce, and so they were willing to fork over for it. They saw their ability to capture some of those gains. That was particularly true when industries were located in one state and were drawing their skilled labor from that state. So they saw paying taxes as essentially an input into their future labor force. Well, the neoliberal economy has really changed that. Companies are no longer really, in an enduring relationship with the state in which they emerged. They're very, very footloose. And what that means is that they're not so sure that they're going to be able to capture the benefits of that investment. And furthermore, they're in a very good bargaining position. They can say, lower my tax rates or I'm out of here. That's happened. There are many, many vivid examples in Massachusetts. I mean, Raytheon basically said, give us tax cuts, hand over the money, or you're not going to get any jobs. And then the state handed over the money, and then Raytheon moved those jobs out of state anyway, because it's very difficult to enforce a contractual arrangement of that type. So, of course, movement overseas is then, outsourcing overseas is just a kind of a elaboration of that trend. And I think that is a fundamental kind of political realignment that has made this kind of big pinch possible. If you add to that.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we see at CUNY is, as the state money has gone, the question is, where are you going to get revenues from? And so they've turned to students, and they increase both the tuition rates as well as the enrollments. And that's a way that they're able to generate more funds. And it's also one problem that we have when we go to the state legislature, because the legislature knows that the SUNY chancellor and the CUNY chancellor are saying, let us increase our tuition. because historically we have low tuition relative to other state universities, certainly in the neighborhood. So there's the argument that there's money to be gotten there. When you're operating on a shoestring, of course, if you are going to increase revenue and you get whatever marginal investment you get by increasing enrollment, there are also the associated costs with serving more and more students. And since 85% of all of our expenditures are on personnel, it really is, there's very little margin there. One of the problems with the funding, and looking at it from the point of view of the state legislature, and this is a little disagreement I may have with Nancy, I think that the Pell Grants, which are a good thing, obviously, it's a good thing, but the way the state legislature looks at it is, oh, good, there's more money. And how am I going to get that money? I'm going to get it by raising tuition and increasing enrollments. And New York State has a TAP program, tuition assistance program, and it's essentially a voucher system. And so when you're funded through vouchers, you more and more will move in that direction. And I think that what that does is the incentive from the institutional perspective, the rational thing to do, as it were, given this framework, is to pump up your enrollments and to control your costs, which are largely labor costs, and you kind of keep them down. And then that leads to what I see is a downward spiral in terms of being able to deliver a quality education.
Well, one of the things that we've been focusing on here at Demos is graduation rates and the fact that they're flat, because partly what you just said, this incentive, I mean, universities get more money, they get rewarded for getting, people enrolled, but not graduating them. So I'm wondering if either of you could say a little bit about this in terms of play out the downward spiral a little bit more.
Well, excuse me, just getting over the seasonal cold. Yeah, thanks. Thinking about I've been really tortured by low completion rates at my university. In my teaching, I teach a big introductory, for many years, I taught a big introductory Economics 103 section, and about 20% of the students failed the class. Not because they didn't not because they were incapable of doing the work, but because they just gave up and stopped attending. And in fact, there's a really high attrition rate at large universities that I think has to do with the fact that it's a pretty impersonal, standardized service. What's interesting to me about it as an economist is that it's a very peculiar product or service that we're providing, because it's kind of co-produced. We don't really sell the product to the student. We sell the opportunity to create the product to the student. And the student actually has to work really hard and be very motivated to take advantage of the product. Otherwise, this product isn't worth very much. And there's a lot of heterogeneity among students. In fact, even from year to year, students, the success of their college environment changes because it's co-produced. So some students can still get a terrific education at my university. But some students absolutely cannot, because they don't get the motivation or the context or the attention, or something's just missing in this complex production process. And I think it's got to be really frustrating for parents too, because when they look for a place to send their kids, they're really looking for a place that's going to create the motivation to completion, and they're willing to pay a really high premium because they're terrified that their kids are not going to click with the institution and get, find that kind of intangible stuff they need in order to complete. Well, what expensive liberal arts colleges do to deal with that problem is they invest tremendously in advising, personal attention and advising and tutoring and fallback stuff, completely missing from the state university environment. And I honestly don't think it would be that hard to change policies away from recruitment and towards retention. And I think there's some movement in that direction, but not nearly enough. Precisely because the budget crunch has forced every administration to concentrate on getting the money they need just to stay open rather than improving those outcomes.
You know, it's actually a funny subject because, you know, it's a political football, essentially. And, you know, it's something that politicians use and they throw it around. Graduation rates and the idea of a 4-year, 5-year, 6-year graduation rate, if you're going to a traditional liberal arts college, you have support from your parents or you have support from the college, you have adequate advising, graduation rates are pretty high. But guess what? If you are poor, you have to work 40 hours a week, you have family responsibilities. The college, in the case of CUNY, doesn't have counseling that is needed or mentoring. Then guess what? Graduation rates aren't so high. But even beyond that, colleges today, especially commuter colleges and community colleges, are not places where students necessarily go to get a degree and they spend their life there for a period of time. They stop in, they stop out, they're in and out. They get a lot of value. And they may take 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years to graduate. But we don't track them, so we don't really know what that student's experience is. If somebody starts at a community college, let's say goes to BMCC, goes there for a year, stops out, goes back, maybe to Queensborough, maybe gets a degree after a couple of years, moves to Massachusetts, and goes to college there. We have no idea what that student's experience has been, but that goes down as someone who hasn't perhaps graduated.
Community colleges, up to now, have played a really important role in helping students get access to better jobs than they would get otherwise through kind of paraprofessional training, like a lot of policemen, a lot of firefighters, a lot of EMTs, a lot of certified nursing assistants. You know, community colleges have especially reoriented themselves towards the health professions in a very, very productive way, and I think that's a really great contribution. But they've been much less successful at getting students out and up into the 4-year colleges. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think partly it's the way that they were initially set up. I think that there's some institutional inertia there that we could address. Community colleges, up to now, have played a really important role in helping students get access to better jobs than they would get otherwise through kind of paraprofessional training, like a lot of policemen, a lot of firefighters, a lot of EMTs, a lot of certified nursing assistants. You know, community colleges have especially reoriented themselves towards the health professions in a very, very productive way, and I think that's a really great contribution. But they've been much less successful at getting students out and up into the 4-year colleges. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think partly it's the way that they were initially set up. I think that there's some institutional inertia there that we could address. I do think it's potentially a divisive issue because expanding community college is kind of expanding public higher education on the cheap. in my view. But I really believe that we could make them complementary and that we could put it all together into a larger vision of possible change. And it's really incumbent on us to do that. Firefighters, a lot of EMTs, a lot of certified nursing assistants. You know, community colleges have especially reoriented themselves towards the health professions in a very, very productive way, and I think that's a really great contribution. But they've been much less successful at getting students out and up into the four-year colleges. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think partly it's the way that they were initially set up. I think that there's some institutional inertia there that we could address. I do think it's potentially a divisive issue because expanding community college is kind of expanding public higher education on the cheap, in my view. But I really believe that we could make them complementary and that we could put it all together. Firefighters, a lot of EMTs, a lot of certified nursing assistants. You know, community colleges have especially reoriented themselves towards the health professions in a very, very productive way, and I think that's a really great contribution. But they've been much less successful at getting students out and up into the four-year